Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, welcome to another night of Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Radio. Tonight, we are doing an interview with Frank Feschino, an expert and author of many books on extraterrestrials. Namely, one of the most famous ones detailing the accounts of the Flatwoods Monster. And we are very glad to have him on tonight.
Yep. And Frank, I know you run a website on the Flatwoods Monster. Before we begin the show, I was going to have you begin with a little bit of your background and what got you started into the whole Flatwoods and UFO phenomenon and the research.
Oh, Ray, about 20 years ago, I was visiting some relatives in Braxton County, and I had spoke to some of the locals in Braxton County and Frametown and Flatwoods area, and I found out there was a lot of anomalies going on in the area. There were crop circles that were appearing overnight in Braxton County. There was tons of UFO sightings. There was actually a couple that I met who lived in Frametown at the time, and they had a flying saucer flying to their backyard. They were on a national television program. And I started going back, visiting a little bit more often and talking to some of these people in Braxton County. And it basically intrigued me what was going on up there with this paranormal activity. And at one point early on in the early 90s, I found out about this story that happened back on September 12, 1952, and it was called the Flatwoods Monster Incident. And it involved a 12-foot-tall alien that was seen shortly after its craft went down. It was damaged, and it crashed on the old Bailey Fisher farm. And I started looking into that story a little bit deeper. So that's basically how I got involved in this whole thing. I just kind of stumbled onto it by visiting some relatives in the area years ago.
Well, for tonight's topic, I was going to, while we're on the whole topic of UFO crashes and the Flatwoods creature, I was going to ask, what exactly did happen at Flatwoods for people that don't know that are listening?
Well, first of all, let me give a little background of what was going on, Jeremy, back in 1952. That was the year that this Flatwoods Monster incident happened. It was a banner year for flying saucers. And the Project Blue Book, who was in charge of investigating and evaluating the UFO reports in the United States and around the world, were documenting what was going on actually between 1951 and 1969. And as I said, 52 was the banner year for flying saucer sightings. And 1952 had the highest amount of reported sightings in Blue Book's history. And there was actually 303 unidentified or unknowns that they evaluated out of 1,501 cases. Now, what's interesting is during that period, which I call basically Summer of the Saucers, and I titled my book after it, Shoot Them Down, there were shoot-down orders in 1952 that were revealed by the Air Force. And during the summer of 52, between June and September, out of the 1,501 reports, 1,134 occurred between June and September, and there was 111 unknowns during that time. So there was a lot of activity going on at that point. And the Flatwoods Monster incident happened at the tail end of the summer of 1952. So we have a lot of things going on in that time frame. And just a few weeks before the Flatwoods Monster incident occurred in West Virginia, there was an International News Service report that hit the press on Tuesday, July 29th, and the articles that were picked up by a few different newspapers, not too many of them around America, but the headlines would read, for instance, jets on 24-hour alert to shoot down saucers. And I'm going to give you a quick quote here to give you an idea of the state of what was going on in America at that time. And this quote reads, "The Air Force revealed today that jet pilots have been placed on 24-hour nationwide alert against flying saucers, with orders to shoot them down if they refuse to land." Well, what we have here is this revelation on July 29th by the INS. About 6 weeks later, the Flatwoods Monster incident occurred, and we had a damaged craft that flew in over the eastern seaboard and landed in West Virginia, which was actually one of three others, total of 4 craft that flew over the United States that night and landed throughout the country.
So, as far as the ships landing, where did the other 3 land? Like, do they know the locations?
There were several different locations. Let me start with the Flatwoods incident first, okay?
All right.
What we have here, approximately 7:30 that night, a damaged ship came flying over Braxton County, and it landed on the back portion of a farm called the Fisher Farm. And that was actually the 11th biggest news story of 1952, and the story hit like wildfire and shotgun around the world, basically in a couple days. And it was carried by the press very heavily throughout that first few weeks after the incident occurred. So we have this major story that came at the tail end of the Summer of the Saucers, where they were basically being seen on a daily basis around the United States. They were being seen throughout the world. But this was the main part of the flap, which is the 1952 flap was this summer. What I did is I looked outside of Braxton County in the Flatwoods area. Now, Flatwoods is the geographical center of the state of West Virginia, and it's about 200 miles west of Washington, D.C. I went north, south, east, and west in an omni pattern, and I looked to see what was going on around Braxton County that night. This thing just didn't drop straight out of the sky. I knew it had to have a beginning point. And like I had said before, over the years, a story basically has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Flatwoods was basically the end of the story. What I did is I started looking through the Project Blue Book documents for that particular night, and I found that this case was documented very heavily. There was actually, all in all, 9 East Coast states which were over a period of 21 hours, where UFOs were seen. And what I did is I went into these different regions, and the areas where they were seen along the East Coast were Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and West Virginia. Blue Book didn't report the Delaware, Ohio, or Tennessee sightings. Now, there were thousands of people over this 21 hours of sustained sightings who saw these UFOs. They were flying in different directions at different times, at trajectories, different flight paths. They were crash landing, taking off, and they were basically puddle jumping throughout the United States. What I was able to do is go into each region and basically follow the flight paths of these objects, because I knew the times that they were sighted, the locations that they were sighted. So I started plotting points on each of these 9 different states. When it became overwhelming, what I had to do is transfer these 9 different East Coast states onto one big major map, and I worked off of that map for several years during my research. If you go on my website, flatwoodsmonster.com, and look under the link on my homepage, Current Information, it's an orange bar. If you click on that, it will take you over to the link, and you can see my master map that I used doing my research and writing my book. And I was able to establish 102 different locations over these 21 hours where UFOs were sighted. And I worked with different people over the years, pilots, astronomers, scientists, people in the Air Force. I worked with cops, state troopers, anybody and everybody who was willing to work with me that could participate into this project. Well, with everybody's knowledge, I started working a little bit closer with these people and looking and analyzing this map. And what I did was able to establish flight lines, which basically means I connected the dots. And because I knew the times and the locations, it's basically following a trail. So what I did is I created this timeline events that occurred over that day, and I was able to use a good portion of the Project Blue Book documentation, which actually, to make a long story short, the Air Force said all the sightings that occurred that day, they blamed it on one meteor that was seen for 5 to 6 seconds over Washington, D.C.
Oh, geez.
So what we have here is a massive, major cover-up that I'm nearly 20 years in the works of putting together.
So were you the first person to figure out that?
Yes, yes. There were past investigators who had looked into some different areas, but they weren't able to establish the foothold and the groundwork and the basic fundamentals I was able to compile together to make this evaluation. And back then, in the early days when this was investigated, we had Ivan Sanderson, Gray Barker, Donald Kehoe, actually investigated this case. The Project Blue Book documents were not classified. They were classified, they were not declassified at that point. So by the time they were declassified later on by the government, what happened is nobody bothered to look back into the case again. That's where I picked the ball up and ran with it. I used some of the information and some of the original notes and documentation from the past investigators. I combined it with the documentation of the Project Blue Book. There's hundreds of pages of this Blue Book documentation. It's amazing how much that they actually cataloged and recorded for this day of what went down. And the Flatwoods Monster case was included within this. And so basically I was able to establish all these flight lines of all these UFOs. And I was able to figure out there were 4 damaged ones. 3 of them came over the eastern seaboard and proceeded west. And the damaged one came from the southeast part of the United States. And West Virginia was the hub. It was like the meeting place. And the majority of these craft all flew into the Flatwoods area. It was a rendezvous. And this is all in black and white. If you look on my map, you can see all the documentation and the times. And I give a quick little synopsis on the website also of the different locations and what happened. But that point right there took approximately 12 years to figure out what happened. I kept researching deeper, and as I go on, more people contact me, and I talk to more witnesses, so I'm able to actually connect the dots a little bit tighter.
Mm-hmm. So was there only one ship that landed in Flatwoods, or was there several that were in like the West Virginia area, and that was the only one that was in Flatwoods?
That one went down in Flatwoods. There was actually 3 different objects that came in over the mid-Atlantic area. We had a UFO that flew in damaged, and that proceeded on a southwest trajectory. And if anybody's listening out there, if they're looking at this map, you can follow along. The first UFO flew southwest, and it was damaged, and it was seen going into the Tennessee area, and it actually flew through the no-fly zone, and this UFO was actually heading towards the Oak Ridge National Laboratory at Oak Ridge. Then if you look at the second UFO, the flight path of that object, it actually flew over Baltimore, went over a portion of Pennsylvania, and went into Ohio, and it was actually going and proceeding dead into the area of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Air Technical Intelligence Center. Those were the people at Blue Booker were in charge of the UFO project, okay? So that we have a second UFO making a direct beeline towards it. The third UFO came right down the middle, and it flew over Washington. That is the UFO that is referenced in Project Blue Book in the final evaluation report. It's Project 10073 record card. And they actually said it was the Washington area meteor, was a fireball. What I did is, once I established all these different locations and plotted these points, we were able to figure out that this object that flew over Washington at approximately 7 p.m. that night passed over the Capitol area. It flew outside of Washington, proceeded west, and it continued west, and it flew a couple hundred miles, and when it hit West Virginia, it went into Braxton County, northern part of Braxton County. It redirected, made a 45-degree angle turn, and followed the main state road all the way into Flatwoods. When it flew into Flatwoods, it made another 45-degree angle turn, and it went and it landed back up on the farm. Now, when this object passed over Washington, it was flying along different portions of its flight path. As it was going west, it was actually flying at treetop level. Pieces were exploding off of it. The thing was on fire. It was flying very erratic. That was actually documented in the New York Times on the following day, on September 13th, and it was called the Flame over Washington. So what we have here is a craft that flew, 3 craft that flew and damaged. One went towards Oak Ridge. The third one went towards Wright-Patterson. When the third one came down the middle and it passed over Washington, my timeline shows when it passed over D.C., flew over the restricted areas of the Capitol, and flew west without being intercepted, because as we know, you're not supposed to fly through the no-fly zones of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
When it passed west over Washington, the other 2 that were flying up towards their other targets of Oak Ridge and Wright-Pat actually turned around and redirected and flew in the opposite direction. And that can all be seen on the master map.
We have a question right now coming in. What is the link? I know on your website they said, what do you click on to find the map?
On current information.
Current information?
There's a horizontal bar that's orange, and you scroll down portion on my website on the home page, and it says current information, or Feschino current information, and it's an orange bar. When you click on that, it brings you over to another website link. And then you scroll down from there, and you'll see the map. There's several different shots of it with details.
Well, I have a couple questions. Okay, so now we're talking about the spaceship. The spaceship crash landed in Flatwood. What exactly did the witnesses see? Like, what did the creature look like?
Well, let me run back to what happened when this craft flew over the town. Okay, it's flying in a southern direction towards Flatwoods. It hits the center of the town. The center of the town is set into like a valley, and it's surrounded by mountains. Okay, this is the center part of the town of Flatwoods. The UFO made another 45-degree angle turn. Unlike meteors, it was flying at low level, treetop level. There were pieces exploding and falling off of it. This thing was a mess. It was completely engulfed in flames. Had a tail shooting off of the back of it. It flew and barely cleared the treetops, and it descended down towards this plateau of a mountain. It didn't come to a mountain peak. It was like a flat plateau area. And this object descended. It didn't crash down. It actually stopped in midair and hovered and just dropped. And when it set down in that area, that's when the kids who were on the school playground, they were on the Flatwoods Elementary School playground, they saw this thing pass over their heads. This whole group of boys are excited. They thought it was a meteor. They saw it coming in from one direction. They ran up to the house about a mile away of Kathleen May. Kathleen May, two of the boys within this group were her kids, Freddie and Eddie. They all go barging into the front door, and Mrs. May is there with her cousin, Gene Lemon. He's 18 years old. He lived in the neighborhood on the other side of Flatwoods. He was there with his dog. He was visiting. Mrs. May had just got home from work. Now you can imagine all these excited kids come busting in the door saying that something landed up on the back hill. It looked like a meteor going down. They wanted to go up there and check it out and see what it was. The group gathered up. They left the house. Some of the kids went home. It was starting to get dark. It's probably about 20 of 8 at this point. The boys with Mrs. May, in the end, there were 7 boys and Mrs. May. Mrs. May was 32 years old. Her cousin, Gene Lemon, he was 18 years old. The next in line was Neil Nunley. He's 14 years old. We have Teddy Neal, 13, Eddie May, 13, his brother Freddie, who was 11, Ron Shaver, 10. Those boys from Nunley to Shaver were on the school playground. Okay, they had seen the thing go down. A little boy who tagged along at the end of the group at the right, who lived in the neighborhood, he was Tommy Heyer. He was the youngest boy. He tagged along. Freddie May brought his dog, Lemon brought his dog, and there was another dog from the neighborhood, which was a big collie, basically looked like Lassie. It was going along with this group. In the end, we have 8 witnesses. They go onto the farm that borders the back portion of the May property. Okay, this is the Bailey Fisher farm. And by now, it's about 9:45 to 10 of 8. And they finally hit the farm, and there's 3 sections of this farm, and this is the easiest way to explain this, guys. There is a first field, which is a flat, wide open field about the size of a football field. Just beyond that first field, there's a second field. That second field is not flat. It's a gully, okay? It slopes from the left down to the right. In the far back portion of this gully field, there are a bunch of pear trees. There's still a few up there now, but I was told back in '52 there was a few more. These pear trees are set towards the back end of the gully within this sloping field. Beyond that, the third part of the property is the mountain. This is where this thing had landed, way out in the back. This is where the group was proceeding to go up when their encounter occurred. So we got any questions up to this point?
Yeah, do you have a question, Nick?
Mr. Feschino, I was just looking over. I see you.
Frank.
Oh, okay, Frank. Oh, okay, Frank. I see that you go and do many lectures around the country. Could you just maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Maybe just tell us, like, what types of things you discuss at your lectures, or is it just similar to what we're talking about now?
Well, when I go on lecture, I talk about what we're getting into now, but I actually have a documentary about the Flatwoods Monster that I put together, and it is very unlike what was aired on the Monster Quest, which the Monster Quest did a hatchet job on my show that was aired back in about mid-March. And I worked with Monster Quest for several months. And the original production crew that taped me and Stanton Friedman, Al Lemberg, John Bainbridge, and Freddie May, and one of the original reporters from a radio station who actually covered the event, we worked for about a week. And when Monster Quest put this whole thing together, it was just a complete abortion. And we were not too happy because the Monster Quest people and the History Channel actually had the makings for probably one of the best UFO documentaries ever. We had everybody together at one place at one time, and they botched the whole thing up. So that was, you know, to me and my group, that was disgusting. And nobody was happy what actually happened and the way they handled it. Basically, once it got out of the production crew's hands, they had done the original draft on it, and it just got distorted, and they turned it into a joke as far as we're concerned. I don't know, maybe they thought it was great, but the people who know the story were very disappointed and disgusted over it, including...
I know the story, and I actually have your Braxton County Monster book, and I was kind of like, what? So when they were showing the whole episode, 'cause it's kind of hard to follow if you didn't already know the story. And then I was thinking, well, they didn't have very long of an episode either compared to, because some of them are 2 or 3 hours long. I'm surprised they didn't make that one a long episode.
Yeah, they should have. They had enough of information. My interview was nearly 6.5 hours long. It started just before 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was in that chair until almost 4:30 in the afternoon. And you could imagine the information that I gave them. You see what an average 1 to 2 hour talk show is. Imagine how much information I gave them, correct and accurate information over 6.5 hours, and they turned it into a joke.
Well, what's strange is we've interviewed other people that were featured on Monster Quest, and we've had similar replies from like most of the people.
Yeah. I've read a lot of stuff online, and I've talked to several people since this was aired, and, you know, I'm getting the same feedback. They were very aggravated, and I don't know, they were trying to reinvent the wheel. But I guess the only way you're going to get to hear the story is to hear it on the radio talk shows like this or come into one of my lectures. I have an hour-long documentary that I put together that was told correctly, and I show that on my lectures. I actually have a brand new PowerPoint I spent 1.5 years putting together about the Flatwoods Monster. That's basically closed caption for the death, and it's very powerful. It hasn't been seen in public yet. And I also have another PowerPoint documentary put together that's called Duels of Death, and it's based on a new book that I just finished writing. So I have a lot of information, a lot of new stuff for the public to see, and whenever I do my lectures, I mix stuff up a little bit because there's a lot of people who follow and go to different ones, so I try and change stuff up as I go along, you know, and because there is so much information. Once I show my documentary, then I do question and answers in my, you know, at my appearances, and I bring along my some of my information and my illustrations. So I'm able to actually interact with the people quite a bit, which a lot of lecturers don't do. I love talking to people and explaining the story, and basically I just will come right out into the crowd and I'll talk to people, or I'll come up to the table and we actually stand around sometimes for several hours well, after the lecture is over and just talking, you know, because people want to know the truth. They want to know what happened, and I'm there to tell them.
One of our other team members just called in, actually. Tim? Yeah, hello? Yeah, Frank's on the line. But anyways.
Hey, Tim.
Hey, Tim? Yeah, hello, my phone's cutting out. How you doing, Frank?
Yeah, good, Tim. It's good to talk to you, man.
Yeah, sorry to call in so late. I got off work late today. Well, I had a question, because, well, anyways, we were talking about how the spaceship landed, or how it landed or crashed, and then you said that these kids were making their way up towards where the spaceship crashed, and then we actually got cut off for a minute there. What did the kids see when they came over the ridge, or when the monster came towards them?
Okay, let me explain what happened, okay? We have Mrs. May is leading the group with Gene Lemon, basically the two adults. There is this big collie dog that's leading up the path with them. As they cross over this first field, Mrs. May told me as she had just reached the crest of this field, she saw way out in the distance a flash of a purplish light. and she couldn't see the exact area where it was. It was coming from way in the back of the property. As their group is proceeding across this path, they're walking up to the left on about a 45-degree angle, where the first field that I explained earlier meets the second field, which is the gully. There was shrubbery growing along that area, and there's a fence, okay? That is the border portion, access of getting into the gully portion of the farm and the back mountaintop. There's a big farm gate there. It's a steel gate, and you guys know what a big farm gate looks like. It's what they would open it back and forth up to let the cattle and horses back in. So this gate was closed, okay, and it was wired. Mrs. May got up to the first gate there with Lemon leading the way and the dog. The rest of the group, the young kids are scattered throughout like a wagon train. They're all lollygagging around. They finally all get up there. They open this gate. The whole group proceeds. Dogs, everybody, Mrs. May, Lemon, the kids are on the other side. They wired the gate shut because there were cattle and horses and, livestock was basically would roam around up there during the year, and sometimes you didn't know if they were out or not, so they had to wire this fence. Now they're on the other side of the fence. They're standing now on a path, okay? The gully is down to their right. To the left-hand side of this dirt path is a line of woods. They start walking up the path. Now the path starts to make an inclination because you're actually going to walk up towards the back of the mountain. Okay, you follow me so far?
Yeah.
They're walking up this incline, and it starts to get a little bit steeper as you're walking along. What had happened in the meantime, from the point when the kids got from the playground to Mrs. May's house, and by the time they went up to the farm, the UFO, which was a gigantic oval-shaped elliptical object, it basically looked like a big egg or a football. This thing was gigantic. It had moved and relocated from the back portion of the mountaintop where it landed and touched down, and it relocated down towards the back end of the farm into the gully. It was less conspicuous sitting back there, and it's sitting way in the back of this pear tree area. The group is looking straight ahead towards the back mountain. Over to the left, we have the woods. I worked with Mrs. May and her son Freddie. They were the two primary witnesses. I've met several of the other ones and talked with them. The ones who I worked the most with were Kathleen and her son. Over the years, all these different interviews, I tape recorded them, audio, visually, and I was able to sit down with them for countless hours over years. This wasn't one or two interviews. You're talking about several years of ongoing interviews with them. I was talking to them on the phone. We were writing letters back and forth. When I would go to West Virginia, we would meet and sit down. I would have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with them. And we formed a relationship where I was not making fun of them. And they took me serious because the press and the reporting of this thing had made a joke out of this story over the years. And the people basically shut down. That's why the Flatwoods Monster story, the truth was never found out, basically because the public made fools out of them. So, and it wasn't just the May family and the group up there. It was everybody who was involved with this whole story. They were made idiots out of. So they basically figured the best way to keep this, to keep the story out of their hair was just not to talk about it. So what we have here is me working with two primary witnesses. And what I'm telling you now is from their actual own words. When the group is walking up this path, off to the left-hand side, there was an area where this terrible smelling sulfur was rolling down this hill. Okay, it's coming down the path and it's permeating towards them. And it made them sick. The group was sick from it. They were coughing, they were gagging, their eyes were tearing. The sulfur smell was pretty horrendous, okay? They had no idea what was causing this. They start walking up a little bit further. Excuse me. They get to a bend in this path up this inclination. There's a second gate there. Now this gate doesn't open. It's basically like a fence. It's made out of wood. It's approximately 4 foot tall. It's fallen down years ago, but actually the remnants of the posts are still there. They were big slats of wood that were nailed from post to post. Okay, Mrs. May got up to this post area, and she was with Gene Lemon, Neil Munley, Eddie, her son, and Ron Shaver. They passed over this gate. They all climbed over it. It's the only way to get up towards that portion of the property to head towards the back mountaintop. They start walking up the path, and this smoky fog starts getting a little bit thicker. Excuse me. At that point, as they're walking up, the dog had taken off like a bat out of hell, this collie. It runs straight into this fog, and it starts yakking and letting up a fit. A few seconds later, the dog yelps, starts barking, carrying on, and it hightails and runs in the opposite direction, and it runs past the group of the first 5 witnesses. It runs back down towards the wooden gate that they had just climbed over, and it took off and went back to the house. In the meantime, we have Freddie May, Teddy Neal, and Tommy Heyer. They were the last 3. They had reached up to that gate area. They had not passed over it. Now you're talking about 30 feet or so from where the lead witnesses are, up at the head of the pack, from where Freddie, Teddy, and Tommy Heyer were. Off to the left-hand side of this path, set about 4 foot up this little rolling ridge towards the perimeter of the woods, is this white oak tree. And it's about 125 feet tall. That's approximately how tall it was back then. It was a pretty big tree. Like I said, sitting back about 4 feet off of the path. This is the area where the smoke was originating. This smoke is billowing out from the area of this tree, and it's rolling down the path. Some of it's going out to the left of the path, to the right, into the gully. So that area was filled pretty good, and it was settling. As they're walking through this, Mrs. May and Gene Lemon noticed something as they were approaching the street to their left. They looked up. What caught their attention was what looked like 2 eyes. They were glowing. They were kind of an orange color. Mrs. May told me they were a funny-looking orange-green color. And these 2 eyes are about 12 feet in the air. Okay, there's a big branch that was just about at the 12-foot mark. Okay, it's darker in towards the wooded area. They hadn't had their flashlights on because they wanted to save the batteries for when they got way the heck up in the back to check out where this meteor had went down. So at this point, they could still see halfway decent without having the need for their lights on. Over towards the left where they saw these eyes, it's a little bit darker up there. So Mrs. May and Gene start walking up towards it to check it out. They thought it was the eyes of a possum or a raccoon that was sitting up on a branch up there. They turned their flashlights on, and they shot the beams up 12 feet in the air towards where these lights are. And seconds later, they found out it wasn't an animal. What they actually had flashed their lights beams on was what's called the Flatwoods Monster. Now, the Flatwoods Monster is not that ridiculous drawing that's been seen in a million different books and magazines with the cloaked head with the scary arms and claws wearing a dress that floated, okay? That was a misrepresentation made by an artist who showed that picture about a week later on a national talk show. The Flatwoods Monster, we're going to call it that for namesake, okay, quotes, Flatwoods Monster, was actually a tall metallic structure that was approximately 12 feet tall. It was like basically a hovercraft. What the smoke and all that horrendous sulfur smell actually was part of the propulsion system that lifted this being off of the ground. And if you look on my website, you can see my illustrations that I did by working with the witnesses. Now, what was great working with Kathleen and with Freddie is I have two witnesses that were basically 30 feet apart who actually saw this Flatwoods Monster. This thing had lifted off the ground, hovered about a foot to a foot and a half off the air, into the air. Mrs. May gave me that quote. She says it was about a foot to a foot and a half off the ground. It floated and hovered down in front of her. That is when Gene Lemon, she told me his legs went rubbery. It freaked him out. He just had no idea. This thing passes in front of Mrs. May, and it has a big, gigantic head with porthole-type eyes, which actually Freddie told me was a helmet. So when I worked with Mrs. May in her interviews over the years, she gave me the detailed descriptions of what this thing looked like up close, because she told me she saw it within the length of a small car, which is just a few feet. It basically, this thing came right out almost on top of him. Freddie May is back at the gate. He told me he had just climbed up the wooden gate, and he was ready to go over when they flashed the flashlights up. So he saw this whole thing fold out in front of him, okay, with the monster and the 5 witnesses. And one of them was his brother who was up there. He was standing behind Gene Lemon and Kathleen. This thing hovers down this little 4-foot inclination, and it goes across the path, and it's blowing dirt all over the place from the ground. It's basically a hovercraft, okay? It was also leaking. It was spewing and splattering this black oil type substance out all over the place. It hit Mrs. May and splattered her from head to toe. She was wearing her work uniform. She was actually a beautician, and back in the day, she had this little outfit, which was like, she told me it was a beige outfit, a dress, and this little cap, okay, that she was covered with the oil when it hit the front of her. She told me that this thing was making noises like it was frying bacon. This thing was very hot. It reminded her of grease or bacon sizzling in a frying pan. This thing was really heated up, and it was actually turning a darker color from the intense heat. So this thing seems to have been damaged as well. The thing passed in front of the group. We have Gene Lemon, who had fallen over. He was half scared to death. A couple of the kids went over. They got him back onto his feet, and they just turned and tore ass back down the path. A couple of them looked back over their shoulders because they didn't know if this thing was coming towards them or where it was going. It actually went across the path out into a field, and it hovered across the field and went back to the downed UFO sitting in the far back of the property. Mrs. May told me she was so scared when she saw this thing, she hurtled over that 4-foot fence and never touched it. That's how frightened she was. The rest of the group was running down. We got the other boys with Lemon. We have Eddie, Neil Munley, and Ronnie Shaver. They all went back down. They jumped over that wooden fence as well. Kathleen said she passed several of the boys down. She was really scared because she was the closest one to it. And the rest of the other 3 boys had taken off ahead of time. When they got back down, now they got another obstacle. They have the big steel gate. Some of the smaller kids squeezed through it. Nobody ever opened the gate. That's how scared they were. They wanted to get off that farm. Some of the kids squeezed through the bars of the gate. Wow. Some of them climbed over it. I mean, they were just harassing. They wanted to get out of there. They didn't want to know anything. And, you know, they were tripping and falling because it was darker at this point. And later on in another interview, Mrs. May had told me that she was able to see the details pretty decent with this so-called Flatwoods Monster, because when she hit it with the beam of her light, and Lemon had turned his light on simultaneously, when the beams actually hit the monster, it actually lit up from the inside, and it was self-illuminating. So, and we have something that is illuminating from the inside. It was actually a craft. It was a shuttlecraft. So she said that she was able to see the details of the thing a little bit better because it lit up.
So it lit up when the flashlight hit it, is what you were saying?
Yes, and it actually reacted. This thing reacted to her. It was basically, it was sensitive to it. It was looking down on them. It was actually hiding up behind the tree. It didn't want to be seen. They stumbled onto it. You know, if they had not went up any further, they never would have seen it. That's why they were so close to it. And I actually sat down with Kathleen and was drawing pictures, and she never went to the site with me. She was an older woman when I had interviewed her, but I sat down, and being an illustrator, I had mapped out the distances from point to point to point. I was taken up there by Freddie, and I interviewed Freddie on location. He told me the whole story. His mom gave me her point of view, and I did these illustrations and drawings with her. And basically, when she came around this swag in the path, you couldn't see this thing that was this big, tall, 12-foot metallic structure because it was actually upset 4 feet behind the tree. That's why when Mrs. May was up there and flashed the lights, this thing, they were almost right up to it. She said the length of a car, a small car. That's a quote. So by the time it came out, it was almost on top of them. If they had stopped a few feet before that tree and turned around and went home, they never would have saw it. But she said this thing reacted to the lights. When the lights hit it, they flashed it up towards the head. They actually reflected and hit the head area of it because they thought it was the eyes of an animal sitting on a limb up 12 foot high. They never expected to see anything like this.
Oh, we have a couple of questions coming in actually right now on our email. Yeah, I have a couple of these I'm going to read real quick. Right now people are saying, so was the creature or the monster, was it all mechanical, or was it some sort of a living being inside of a hovering craft like you were saying before?
Well, this is what I was able to distinguish over the years. Let me tell you what happened first, guys. When Mrs. May went on a national television show with Gene Lemon, okay, a week later, they were contacted a few days after the incident, and they went to New York with Ailey Stewart Jr. He was the Johnny-on-the-spot reporter. I interviewed him and actually stayed at his house for a few days in North Carolina. And we talked for hours. I interviewed Stewart, and I worked with Kathleen May, and they both told me they appeared on this national TV show. It was aired in New York on NBC television. It was called We the People, and it was hosted by Daniel Seymour. The two witnesses, Kathleen and Gene, went up to New York. They were flown up there, and Stewart accompanied them. So we have two primary witnesses and a reporter who broke the story. Stewart was actually the first person of authority who went to the house and went on site that night with a posse. There was a bunch of armed guys up there with shotguns and handguns. So he was a key part of this story, and he had not been interviewed since this thing happened in '52. And like I said, I spent days with him. And I lived in his house, and we went over this thing night and day, and then he did the interview with me, and he told me the basic fundamentals as I was putting my timeline together for doing my research of what happened. Well, when they got on the television show, when they arrived there, they were in the studio, and they had a sketch artist for We the People who went up to Kathleen and Gene, and they basically said, what did this thing look like? And they're trying to give their descriptions, and it must have been tough for the illustrator at that time to draw something, and these people are trying to describe something like that. Stewart kept banging it into my head while I was with him and speaking to him for years over the phone. We had ongoing relationship here. He kept saying, Frank, you're living, now I interviewed him in the mid-90s, actually in 1996, right before he died. He says, you have to think outside of the box of modern era. He said, this happened in central West Virginia in 1952, okay? There was only a couple cars, a couple radios, and a couple televisions in the whole county. Now, Braxton County is a huge area, and it was not a metropolis by any means. So he kept saying that these are young kids, you know, from these different ages of 6 up to 18 years old. There was no computers. He told me there were no niceties. These kids were basically dirt poor, okay? The families basically lived off of the land, and they didn't have money, okay? They didn't have money to buy books and comic books and all that type of stuff. You know, that was basically out of the question. What we have here is a bunch of country kids. Stewart interviewed these kids at length and grilled them. And he was convinced that they had seen something up there, and it wasn't an animal in a tree. He goes to New York with the 2 primary witnesses. They sit down with the sketch artist before the show is aired, and he says, what did this thing look like? Mrs. May and Lemon are describing this 12-foot-tall creature. It hovered off the ground, and if you've ever seen the sketches or the drawings of it, what you basically have is an incorrect drawing. The artist didn't do it accurately. A portion that was really off base is when Mrs. May was trying to describe the lower portion of this craft, and that's what I'm going to call it as a craft because it was a craft. The lower portion basically looked like a booster rocket, okay? From the shoulder area, Freddie and Kathleen said it was about maybe a little over 3 foot wide at the shoulders, and then it flared out towards the bottom. Mrs. May, okay, now you have to figure a housewife in 1952 who nobody had ever seen anything like this or anything that resembled this, even today. This thing around the lower circumference of the torso from the waist down had big, thick pipes coming out of it, and they were set intermittently and evenly around the lower portion there. Okay, Mrs. May is trying to describe these pipes, and when the artist said, well, what did it look like? What does it remind you of? She said, it reminds me of the pleats hanging in my curtains. You know, her drapes hanging in the living room. Mm-hmm. And what she was describing is these pleats. She was trying to get the point across that they were pipes that resembled the pleats hanging down. And her drapes, instead of drawing pipes on the lower portion of the drawing, the artist took her word literally, and he drew this thing in a dress. So you have a monster that's 12 foot tall wearing a dress. She told the artist, and Lemons told the artist as well, from the area of the shoulders, okay, the shoulder plane, it looked like antennas sticking out. Okay, they were like these little pattern of antennas coming out, and that was off of the shoulders. He took those little antennas and made them into big, gigantic arms and made claws at the end. So now he turned this thing into a monster, okay? And if you look at my illustrations, you could see the difference when you put them side by side, okay? That was actually a metallic structure. The head area, Mrs. May saw it up pretty close. Freddie saw this thing from a distance, so he saw a good long shot of it. So he was able to judge the height of his mom and his brother and the other kids standing there in front of it. And it was about 12 foot tall, close to 12 foot. They were able to establish that is because this thing was parked underneath the tree before it lifted off and it came down in front of them. It was underneath a branch. Now, they went and measured some of the townspeople, and later on I spoke and interviewed Colonel Dale Levitt. He was sent there by the Air Force. The Washington had actually contacted him, and he went up there. and we'll get into that later a little bit. But what we have here is this branch that was about 12 foot up in the air. This structure, when it lifted up, it just about touched it and was able to clear this branch when it hovered down. So that's how they were able to gauge the height of it at about 12 feet. It wasn't just, oh, it was 10 feet, 12, 15 feet tall. They knew it was under this branch, and when they went back and took the measurements, they went up there with ladders, they were able to establish it was nearly 12 feet tall. So now we have this thing 12 feet tall. It has the lower portion is flared out, and it has these pipes going around it. The pipes are actually were exhaust, and that was what was emitting the sulfur smell and the smoke. The upper torso area had the antennas, which were drawn into arms and claws, and then we have this ace of spades type covering over the top of its head. If you look in the original drawing done in '52 by the sketch artist, it looks like a big hood, like a big cloaked hood coming over the top of the head. The head was portrayed as like a flesh and blood head with bulging eyes coming out of it. The head itself was actually an inner helmet. The inner helmet was set inside of this barrier in the front, which Freddie and Kathleen said resembled the window. It was basically some type of a clear glass or lucite, I don't know what it was, but it was a clear barrier. And the ace of spades structure that was surrounding it was actually a helmet device. So from talking with the witnesses, what we have here is something that looks like looking in comparison into the cockpit of a fighter jet, where you have the fighter pilot sitting inside with his helmet on, with the canopy being the outer shell, which actually resembled this ace of spades. So we have this thing inside with it was basically, you could say, a fighter pilot's helmet. Instead of having a visor, the witnesses told me that it had two big, gigantic porthole-like openings, like something was inside of it looking out at them. That's why when I said earlier, when the lights were directed at it from the flashlights, this thing lit up from the inside, excuse me, and the beams that shot out actually were light forced from the inside of the suit that pushed their way out. And these beams actually shot over the tops of their heads. They weren't science fiction, Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon death rays that shot out. It was actually forced light. It's been brought up to me, a comparison would be similar to looking at your car with the interior lights being on at night in a pitch dark. You see the illumination from the dashboard lights and the LED lights that are pushing out. Basically, that's how this was described to me. So we have this structure that is 12 foot tall, this metal type material. And when it went in front of the witnesses, it was actually blowing the dirt away. When it went into the field, it actually blew a path approximately 4 foot wide. Now the field where this gully is, the grass was in areas like knee to waist high, okay? When I spoke to Ailey Stewart Jr., he was up there that night with a couple of the boys who directed him up there, and he was up there with his posse. All these guys were armed. They were checking out the whole area with these, what he called them, were electric lanterns. They were big, gigantic flashlights. He saw two paths cut through the area of the grass, and he said it basically looked like if you had taken a gigantic leaf blower that was 4 foot wide and you walked through the path, you know, and you laid all the grass down. He said there were rocks flipped over in it, so this thing had a lot of force from the propulsion system of it hovering through the grass. It actually, when it relocated from the back portion of the farm into the gully, this object left the craft, came through the field and it left one trail going all the way up to the tree. After the encounter, when the group saw it, it went across the path, splattered the oil all over the closest witness there, Mrs. May. It went back and it followed its first path. So you have two gigantic paths about 4 foot wide cut through the grass. And it went out to the area, and that area was about 20 feet across where the craft had actually come down towards the ground. And that was the second landing area. So there was a lot of trace evidence up there, a lot of documentation of what had actually happened. And it's just right now nearly 20 years of piecing this story together, figuring out what happened and why it happened.
Well, right now I have 2 more quick questions before we get started on our other topic. What ended up happening to the spaceship itself after the sighting? Did it take off again, or was it just they don't know what happened? Or
what happened is after it took off, it was actually seen by a witness in the area, and it kind of took off in a pendulum-type motion, and then it hovered in some type of a circular pattern, and it took off, and it was seen throughout Braxton County. It went along the Elk River, and it landed on James Knob, or James Knoll, up on the back portion of this big, gigantic mountain. And it touched down in that area, and it was seen by a couple of the James boys. That area is the area where I was with Monster Quest people. That was James Knob. Those were some of the establishing shots of looking out over the Fraintown area. That's where the craft actually touched down. After it touched down there, I have no record of it leaving.
So the creature wasn't ever seen again after the initial sighting with the maze?
Well, yeah. Well, after it was seen by the maze, the following day, what was seen was what we now call the Fraintown or Snatowski incident. That portion was aired on the Monster Quest episode. That was pretty accurate there. And that part of the story wasn't too far out. They worked pretty well with that. So what we have here is some people who had actually seen this, what was called a 9-foot-tall creature, and that was this green thing they showed on the Monster Quest episode. And I spoke to the primary witness and interviewed him. I found some of the original articles about the incident, and I pieced this whole thing together. So what we basically have here is what was seen was a reptilian creature, approximately 9 feet tall, that was seen from the head down to the waist. From the waist down, it was still actually in the suit. And this thing had emitted the same type of this gas. The witness said it was a horrendous smell. It smelled like it was sulfur. Same like what was noticed in the Flatwoods case. There was a UFO that was seen hovering out in the woods of Fraintown off the edge of the road. This thing had a purplish white glow to it, basically the same what Mrs. May had seen. But this thing was seen going towards it. I don't believe that was the same craft that was damaged and went down. This thing was actually hovering off to the side of the woods when this couple and their young 18-month-old baby came into the area. They were basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was 24 hours later, and this was the area where I had tracked the Flatwoods Monster into, and that was the last time it was seen on September 12th. There was another UFO actually seen over the Bailey Fisher farm later on that night that was basically, you could say it was doing an area check. It was seen hours later by one of the locals. this UFO came over to Bailey Fisher Farm and was actually circling it like it was looking for something. The craft had actually left in, 17 miles southwest.
Well, another thing... Oh, sorry, you can go ahead. Oh, well, I had another quick question that was coming in. Can you elaborate a little bit on your findings with the burnt material on the ground in the tree with Monster Quest?
Well, what I actually did is I gathered up some pieces and I sent them off to be tested and analyzed before what was seen here, and I didn't get any results back. Okay, what was seen on Monster Quest, they sent that material away, so they actually had some stuff that I had taken out of the environment from 15 years ago, plus what they found on location. And to make a long story short, they still do not know what caused that tree to die. They have no idea. That tree, like I said earlier, guys, it was about 125 feet tall. It's basically a little piece of a shell now. I had been documenting that tree for about 20 years, and I got tons of photographs of it throughout the years. I have pictures of that tree from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And right now it's turning into sawdust.
I know.
You could reach down into that tree and just grab it and crush it in your hand. And the lower portion of it is actually like sawdust. I have tons of it. I have this stuff in Tupperware boxes. And it continues to decay and break down. It looks like, if you want to cut a piece of wood with a jigsaw and all the sawdust that falls onto the floor, that's what the tree looks like. Literally sawdust. And I have boxes full of this sawdust that is just broken down. And white oak is one of the hardest trees in the world. And nobody has been able to establish or tell me what actually caused that tree to die. They don't know.
That was that the spaceship actually went through the tree, or is that where the creature actually, where the gas was near that tree?
Right. That was the oak tree that was off to the left of the path. Okay, that was a healthy 125-foot tall tree. The Flatwoods Monster, which was a miniature spacecraft, was hovering up behind it. It was leaking oil. Okay, there was a puddle of oil on the ground, and it was actually splattering oil. This thing was hot. Remember, Mrs. May said it sounded like it was like frying bacon. It was sizzling. She said she felt heat from the area. So this thing was basically really heated up. And one of the other witnesses said it looked like it was heating up like a poker iron. It was just really turning red to black hot. This thing was really fired up. The nickname of the Green Monster actually comes from the environment that had reflected upon it, because this thing was actually metallic and it looked like an aluminum grayish color. Okay? That time of the year, there was a lot of greenery and shrubs in the tree and everything in that area. So when this thing lit up and they flashed the lights on it, the environment from the grass and the trees, the leaves, everything in that area reflected on it and made it look green. But it was actually like a grayish aluminum silver color. So that's where the misidentification of it comes into play, where they call it the Green Monster.
Well, right now we have close to an hour left in the show. I was going to get started on your book called Shoot Them Down. You mentioned earlier about the saucer wars, where our government was sending Air Force planes to try to go after these crafts and UFOs. I was wondering, can you explain a little bit about what you wrote on your website, where you said that they would try to talk these crafts out of the air?
Yeah, well, what we have is this International News Service report that states that the pilots are and have been, so this had been going on for quite a few years before, under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down, which in other words, unless these things, upon receiving orders from the pilots that you're in a restricted zone, you're going to be shot at if you don't, go down and land. So unless the aliens were going to understand English, it was basically shoot first and ask questions later. And we have a history going back a few years of these encounters going on. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's investigation of UFOs, has several incidents where there was encounters and interactions between fighter jets and UFOs. Some of them are on my website, and you could look a few of them up. But there is a history. This thing just wasn't pulled out of left field. The jets were chasing after these UFOs for quite a long time, and then there was finally an order to shoot them down if you can't talk them down. And we also have, who comes into the picture, was Major General Roger Ramey. Back in 1952, at the time all this was going on, he was the Deputy Chief of the Air Force Staff for Operations, and there was an article that gave a Roger Ramey quote. It was actually the Louisville Courier-Journal on July 30th, 1952, and they were at a press conference covering the famous UFO Pentagon press conference in Washington, D.C., and the press reporters quoted Ramey and said that Ramey said interceptor planes have raced aloft several hundred times as a result of reported sightings of unidentified objects. He said that was just standard procedure. That press conference actually took place on the 29th. It appeared in the newspapers on the 30th. So we do have a long history of stuff going on over the years with these UFOs and the shoot them down orders. After this was revealed by the INS report on the 29th, you fast forward up 6 weeks, we have 4 damaged objects coming over the United States, and you could see it on my master map where all of these different objects flew. So Flatwoods was not an isolated incident. We had a lot of stuff going on.
Sorry to interrupt you, but do you have do you know of any, do you have the actual report or any reports around the time that the Flatwoods Monster was seen that might have been the Air Force going after that specific case?
I don't understand what you mean.
Oh, because you said that the ship was damaged, like almost like, I was saying maybe, do you have any reports of the Air Force maybe shooting at that ship or maybe being involved in?
No, that's where the contrast is. The Air Force said it was a meteor. They called it the Washington Era Meteor. And that was their explanation, that what was seen was actually a fireball meteor, to be more accurate. And
well, another thing I was wondering was, did the pilots or the government actually get any responses when they tried to talk to these spaceships on radio?
What happens, according to what I've read in the Project Blue Book documents, is they went after them quite a few times, and the newspapers have even reported that they've taken shots at them. You know, they were definitely going at them. You know, what we have here in that same International News Service report, here's a quote for you. Several pilots, according to the Air Force, have tried to shoot down the mysterious discs. And that's a quote. So, you know, they were going after them. There were attempts made at them. They were just never admitted to any of them going down. And like I said, what we have here, 6 weeks after this revelation, we have 4 damaged ones going down. And they weren't saucer-shaped. These were they basically looked, they were elliptical, the ones that were seen that night, and some of them were round. And there was one reporting in North Carolina and another reporting in the West Virginia, Ohio area of discs. So we just have a couple reports. All the rest of them that night were these oval and round-shaped objects. And what the Project Blue Book record card actually gave for their conclusions was astronomical. And here's the quote for what they said about the monster. The West Virginia monster, so-called, actually the object was the well-known Washington area meteor of 12 September, landing near Flatwoods, West Virginia. Well, here's the thing about this so-called fireball meteor. There was never any sonic booms noted, okay, anywhere throughout the United States, and there would have been a big sonic boom and a flash of some sort. And if this meteor had, according to what they said, landing near Flatwoods, if that had hit in the Flatwoods area, especially where the group saw this thing going down, it would have left a hole in there in the ground that would have been a gigantic, which would have been called an impact pit. There was never any impact pit. I've been up through that area with a fine-tooth comb. I've been taking on expeditions throughout that area. I never saw any big, gigantic meteor impact pit. The original investigators noted that there was a landing spot up there on that back hill that was depressed down into the ground. The second area were relocated into the gully. Colonel Levitt from the United States Army, who was in the National Guard back then, told me there was a big area pressed down in the gully. And the official meteorite explanation is given through the Air Force was actually through an astronomy club who gave all the stats and the lowdown on this so-called fireball, and they said its actual velocity was 27 miles per second. Now, if something flying 27 miles per second had hit the ground, it would have been called flattened woods, not flatwoods.
Yeah.
So we have a very obvious cover-up here. And another point to raise here, guys, is when this thing was seen over Washington, which it was in the New York Times as Flame Over Washington is what they called it, it took approximately a half an hour for this Flame Over Washington to fly approximately 200 miles west. It flew over Virginia, went to West Virginia, and turned. Meteors don't turn. But what we have here is something that took a 30-minute duration to hit from Washington to Flatwoods. If that was a meteor flying at 27 miles per second, it would have just taken a few seconds, not a half an hour.
Well, Nick, did you have a question?
Oh, actually, well, I was just reading, Frank, about some experiences that you've had with gathering these information. You've been heckled, and is there any things that really stuck out to you through the years, like your most, I want to say your most aggravated heckler throughout the years, if you don't mind sharing that?
Basically, the one fellow who started out years ago on his crusade against the Flatwoods Monster was a guy called Joe Nickel, and he actually appeared in the Monster Quest show, but he has a very weak case. He has never confronted me one-on-one, and he cannot disprove my data. My data comes right from the government files, and nobody has yet to override my points and my research and discoveries, because everything I have that I was able to establish my evaluations is based on government documents. It was basically so much was going on back then, and Stanton Friedman has worked with me close over the years on this case, and he basically said to me, you know, back in that era, they had to cover this up real quick, because you have the 1952 flap, the United States was in a near panic because UFOs and saucers were seen around the United States, throughout the world. They were seen in over Korea during the war. The whole world was being basically invaded by UFOs and flying saucers. The press is covering this very heavily throughout the whole 52 era. We have the back-to-back weekends of the flyovers over Washington, where the UFOs flew through the restricted areas of Washington, D.C. This was covered very extensively throughout the world. The Pentagon press conference meeting tried to tamp it down and close the whole UFO thing down and put the curtain down in front of it. It didn't work too well. Then the sightings continued. Just because Washington said that there may have been temperature inversions doesn't mean that the aliens were up there and listening, and they didn't care. They still kept coming back. So what we have here is a continuation and a pattern of this flap occurring through 52 up to the point of the Flatwoods Monster incident. Now you have a woman, a guy, and a reporter going on nationwide television, and these witnesses are saying, this is what we saw. Now the public flips out and they go into a frenzy again. And Donald Kehoe actually reported in one of his books how this television show actually concerned Americans, and they were pretty worried about it, because you have millions of people seeing it, and they're going, what the hell is this? What we've been seeing and reading about UFOs or flying saucers for years now, since 1947, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52. Finally, one of them lands, and this is what they look like when they get out. And this story shotgun around the world within a few days. It wasn't taken, too lightly. What happened is, by the time it got onto the national television show, and the guy drew this ridiculous picture of this monster. So this is where I had stepped into the picture about 20 years ago, and I was able to find out it wasn't a monster. It was actually a small craft. Then throughout my investigation, I found out about the Frametown incident the following day. My conclusion was this was some type of a reptilian alien that was in a shuttlecraft. When it was seen in Flatwoods, it had the full suit on, basically like a suit of armor from head down to toe. When it was seen the following night, we have the basic structure of it from the waist to the lower portion where these exhaust pipes were, and it was hovering, except they saw the actual entity that was inside of it. And that was the entity that had the big head. It was reptilian looking, and it had long spindly arms with these forked fingers at the end. That's what George Santowski and his wife Edith actually saw.
Well, I was just wondering, how many UFOs and airplanes total were shot down in these skirmishes, like dogfights?
Well, the Air Force and Project Blue Book go into some of the encounters, but they never officially released any statistics of how many were ever shot down. That's where my research came into play a few years ago, when I found out about these shoot-down orders. And I looked into it a little bit more in-depth, and I started going over some of the aircraft accident reports with Stan Friedman, which he had obtained a few years back. I started looking into other directions, and I started reviewing some of the New York Times articles from the New York paper. And what I did is I started back just post-World War II into the Kenneth Arnold 1947 era, and I started looking up airplane accidents and different things like that. As we started going from 47, 48, 49, 50 into 51, there was a lot of them, a lot of crazy stuff going on in about 51. And 51 through 1956, I was overwhelmed and blown away when I found out how many planes were disappearing over the United States and throughout the world and crashing under these ridiculous circumstances. And I found out between that 51 and 56 era that there was 205 incidents that had fighter aircraft involvement where the aircraft were completely destroyed or missing. And then there was incidents where we have multiple jet crashes. We have, I found there was 13 multiple jet crashes where between 2 and 4 jets all went down at the same time. No mid-air collisions, planes coming in for landings on approaches would just vanish into thin air. Jets were taken off on scrambles after unidentified objects and just vanishing. But the one thing that was scary when I started looking into this even closer, these New York Times articles, is the amount of combat veterans that had disappeared and died under these kooky and crazy circumstances. There were tons of them. Seasoned veterans from World War II and Vietnam, and we have jet aces, from Korea, guys who fought in World War II who were aces, and these guys are just vanishing over the United States into thin air and crashing under these ridiculous circumstances. And I write about all of those in the 6 Deadly Years chapter. Since then, I've found a lot more information out, and I have another book that should be coming out in the near future. That's called Duels of Death. We got a lot of crazy stuff going on, during that era that was covered up. I worked on a case for several years that involved a missing jet that vanished off the face of the earth off the coast of Florida right before the hell broke loose over the mid-Atlantic part of the United States. And I spent several years documenting this case, and I found more errors and lies and cover-ups in this particular case than I did in the Flatwoods case, and that was a lot. So we got a lot of stuff going on that was covered up, very sloppy cover-up. And I say sloppy because it was put together and covered up so quick and so fast because these stories just hit so fast, and nothing like this had ever happened before. So the government had to come up and work with, figure out all these different excuses they're going to come up with to hide this from the American public. So you have, and it's the old standard when you have that many people involved from around the United States, from all the different branches of the service. You have the Navy was involved, the Air Force was involved, the FBI, Central Intelligence. All these people were involved in covering the story up, and certain parts of the story slipped through the cracks, and there were holes in the story. One hand didn't know what the other one was doing, and this thing happened so fast in such a short amount of time, they didn't know what to do with it. And how are they going to explain all of these sightings? That's why it's ridiculous. It was a meteor seen for 5 to 6 seconds. Absolutely absurd. I tracked 21 and a half hours of sustained sightings. 21 and a little bit over about 21 and a half hours. And they're all documented and in black and white. And if you look on the maps, you could actually see them there. These UFOs were crashing throughout the United States.
So would you say overall there was more airplanes and more UFOs that got shot down?
It seems there was a lot more American fighter jets that went down than anything. We really do not have a definitive answer. Because these accidents were covered up, and with such ridiculous excuses, it's actually a crying shame. I work with some military guys who were fighter pilots and mechanics who were actually quite upset when they read the documentation because it was so absurd. I worked with an air traffic controller who had about 20 years experience, and when I was going over some of this documentation with him, he couldn't believe it. When I first approached him and asked him if he would work with me, and I told him a couple instances, and he looked at me like I was nuts. And I says, no, I have the documentation from the government documents that said this. And he just like, no, you got to be kidding me. You know, it's when you start looking into these reports a little bit closer and you actually sit there and read them word by word by word, the average person isn't going to understand a lot of the, you know, the words used or the technological aspects of it. But when you start talking to people who actually work in the field, which I did, I worked with a lot of people, and this is when I started getting the feedback, and they says, no, that's not right. This whole thing's ridiculous, and it's crazy. Some of the fighter pilots that I worked with as well were just blown away with the excuses. Some of the mechanics, jet mechanics who I spoke to were in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I worked with a lot of Nam vets. They were able to give me a lot of input and say, no, this is a bunch of crap. Just throw that away. This is really what happened. You know, and it just takes a lot of years of investigation and breaking stuff down and finding out and weeding the crap away from the truth, because it's all tied and intermingled together. That's why these research cases take so many years. Like Stanton Friedman's Roswell incident, you know, and we have a lot of other guys that are doing the same thing as myself. It just takes years of weeding everything away to get into the truth. Exactly. And it's not easy because a lot of these documents are hundreds of pages long.
Oh, yeah.
You know, these reports aren't tiny. You know, they go from an average that I've seen is about 65 pages up to 200 pages just for one crash incident. You know, and they take years to review and go over. This is why it's a slow-moving process. And
exactly.
You know, if we had a lot more guys doing it, we'd be able to probably solve this thing a lot quicker, but we don't. But we just have to rely on basically a few dedicated people to do this.
Yeah, and that reminds me too. Oh, yeah, because that reminds me, I've also heard of, like, American scrambling jets. I've also heard the Soviets and even the British have also sent jets to try to shoot down UFOs, too.
Yeah, yep. My new book, the Duels of Death book, I actually go into the RAF aspect and the problems that they were having in Britain. I know a lot of the Russian documents that were released over the past few years after the nation folded have come forth. And I even saw a documentary recently where it actually showed gun camera shots in color of UFOs and flying saucers from Russian fighter jets. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that I wasn't even aware of that until recently. You know, some of the Russian footage that I saw in the documentary, a lot of stuff was going on. Britain was having the same problem with the crashes as the Americans were. And my new book, I tie all of them together, and I go into a lot of other countries. So this wasn't a problem that was only happening here. It was a problem happening throughout the world. And the sad part is a lot of the incidents that were happening in Britain and throughout the world involved American fighter jets as well. It wasn't just foreign nations, you know, because we had bases all over the world. And a lot of crazy stuff was going on. So we have a cover-up of several nations keeping the lid down on all of this. And a lot of this stuff is starting to come out now. And that's when you start putting the big pieces together of all the different countries and where all this stuff was going on, vanished jets. You know, in some instances there were multiple jets that vanished into thin air.
Well, so we have a caller, actually, that's calling in to ask you a question.
Yes.
And 208, you're on the line.
Hi. Hi, this is Lisa with Ghost Finders Ghost Radio. How are you?
Oh, hi, Lisa.
Good. I just had a question. I was just wondering if people are out there at all trying to find, or if they have a team out there trying to find what this is.
They're trying to find what?
If they're out there actually trying to find out what this is, or they have a team out there trying to find it, or You know,
that would be a good question for Frank.
Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear too well.
Oh, she wanted to know if there's any sort of like a team or a group that goes out and looks for that goes over these reports and goes out and looks for things like this.
What, for the missing aircraft?
No, I'm talking about the green monster, or the monster in Virginia.
Well, the thing in Virginia, that was that one particular incident with Flatwoods. That was an isolated case. We had the Flatwoods incident that happened on the 12th, and on September 13th, we had that Spitowski incident. And that's basically the end of the story there. When I did the shoot with the Monster Quest people, that one section there where I had interviewed a man on one of my book tours, he told me about the thing that he saw in Frametown, the 3 different aliens that had those bullet-type Ace of Spades coverings over their heads. But that was years later. What we were trying to establish there is that there's been different things seen in Braxton County over the years. These things were a little bit smaller. They weren't as big as the Flatwoods, what was seen at Flatwoods. But there still is different things going on in Braxton County. There's been Birdman sightings in Frametown. There was actually a Bigfoot sighting along the border of Braxton County and Webster County quite a few years ago. Then we have, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Braxton Beast.
I haven't heard of that yet.
Have you seen the footage of that, the trap camera that took the Braxton Beast footage?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that Braxton Beast, it looks like that red thing with horns coming out of the top of its head. That was seen in Braxton County about 7-8 miles away from Flatwoods.
Oh, my gosh.
We do have stuff that's been going on there for nearly 60 years. Okay? Different sightings of different types of entities.
Yeah.
What I was referring to when I was being interviewed about the 60 years of sightings that Stanton and I and Alfred all kept going to, which was not told correctly in the editing process. I was talking about nearly 60 years of UFO sightings. The way that it was edited and cut and put together, it made it sound like it was 60 years of the Flatwoods Monster sightings going on, which was totally wrong. But there is other things that have been going on in that area.
Yeah. Well, that's scary, isn't it? I wouldn't want to run into something like that.
There's some scary things going on up there, but the Flatwoods case was basically an isolated case.
Yeah.
But there has been other things seen up there. And
oh my gosh.
The main things that have been seen up there have been the UFOs. There's still reports of different things that have been seen up there over the years, but the UFO sightings are the dominant part of it. Like I said earlier in the show, we had a couple who lived in Frametown in 1990 who had a UFO fly into their backyard. That was on the show Current Affair. So we have a documentation of stuff going on, not just in Flatwoods, but it was predominantly in Frametown. We had the Frametown Monster incident in September 1352. We have this incident here that happened that was reported on Current Affair. There's been Birdman sightings up there, the Bigfoot sightings back, I think it was 1960, along the Braxton County border. So there's been sporadic sightings over there. The consistent sightings are the UFO sightings. There's also been crop circle sightings. There's some shots that I took that are on my website near my map. Have you seen those?
No, I haven't seen those yet, no.
Okay, and then I have a couple shots of some UFOs that I took in the Frametown area a few years back. So if you look on that one page where the maps are on current information, you can see a lot of different things that actually were supposed to have been on the Monster Quest episode, but were deleted and cut.
Now, what was the name of your website again?
It's flatwoodsmonster.com.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll get on there and see and look, and that just had me kind of interested. I don't know. Normally I'm not interested in this sort of thing, but I don't know why I am now. It just seems like, there's so much going on anyway. And, sooner or later maybe they'll get somebody to actually catch one of these things. That would be interesting. Because then I don't know what we're going to say then.
Yeah.
But, that will get everybody's tongue because they won't know what to say when they finally catch something like that. So I think sooner or later they will. It's just going to take a little more time, but...
I hope you're brave. That's a scary area up there.
I wouldn't want to mess around up there at all. No. Mhm.
Yeah, cameras looking for UFOs. I got some footage, video footage, some of the still shots that you'll see on my website there. I have some time exposure shots, some still shots. And it's so dark up there at night when there's no moon or outside sources. You're in the mountains. You can't even see your hand in front of your face. It's that dark.
No wonder things are going on. They probably think that's the perfect place for them to hang out because nobody's going to find them, Or maybe they know that.
Very isolated up there. Mm-hmm. Very dark and scary.
Is that the area where they
don't trespass on anybody's property up there?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to buy property up there. Is that the area where? Huh? Pardon?
Don't trespass on people's property up there. A lot of people still shoot first and ask questions later. Just like
I don't blame them. I don't. I really don't. Yeah, that's too scary for me. I don't like that sort of thing. I'm trying to find a place where I can go do an investigation, and that probably would be the place, sounds like, where a lot of people are afraid to do investigations in places like that. If you notice, there isn't a whole lot of it. They go to the haunted houses, and they go to the haunted places, caves and stuff like that. But they don't go to these haunted forests and different places like that. Because I think they're, and I'm not going to say this because I'm trying to be mean, but I think it's just too scary, and I'm not afraid to go in there and do that. So I'm going to try to find a place here pretty soon where I can go and take a camera crew and just go in there and see what I can see. And I think that would be the place.
Well, good luck to you and bring lots of flashlights.
Yeah, I probably should do that, but... the less light, the better. Huh? Pardon?
Dude, don't go up to West Virginia in hunting season.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to do that. You get hurt.
Oh, yeah, hurt or killed.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I'm serious.
Okay, well, yeah, that would be scary. I don't think I'm going to get shot at, so, yeah, that would be a scary thing. Anyway, thank you for talking with me then, and wish you luck on everything.
Thanks for calling in.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Well, Frank, I was thinking, you said, how the Air Force was chasing after these UFOs. I was thinking, you would think that if they shot these UFOs down, that they wouldn't be of any use or much use to them if they're all damaged and blown up.
It depends how good of a hit they got on them, and they wanted pieces off of this thing, and it's been documented going on for years. That they wanted a piece off of them. This went on through the 50s. And I even got something here. There was a quote by Major General Joseph Kelly, United States Air Force, and Donald Kia reported on it in 1957. And Kelly actually said, Air Force interceptors still pursue unidentified flying objects as a matter of security to this country and to determine technical aspects involved. And they want to try and figure out what makes them tick. And if they can get a piece of them by shooting them down and figuring out how they work, that's advanced technology. What we have here is basically the Air Force wanting to get something.
So you said some of these airplanes vanished in thin air, it says on your website. It says some of them were just, like you said, they never found a plane or they never found out what happened to them. What do you think ended up happening to those people? Like, where do you think they went?
Well, that's a good question. What's been talked about for several years is that they've been swallowed up and taken away. Or they've been completely disintegrated. We don't know. We have instances and tons of them where these planes just fly off on a mission. Fighter jets we're talking about. There was a lot of planes, and actually commercial planes, that disappeared, hundreds, thousands of them over years. But what I just have been studying, and there's some other great researchers doing the other end of the aircraft. I'm just looking at fighter jets that were scrambled and a plane that just took off or on missions. A lot of them were said to be routine training missions. And after a while, it just gets to be too ridiculous with these routine training missions, these combat veterans and seasoned fighter pilots just vanishing over into thin air. What I've done over the years is I've made tie-ins and correlations between areas where UFOs have been seen and where these jets have disappeared or crashed. And that whole web is coming together, and there's some other people that I'm aware of who are also doing this around the world. So, we have a lot of dedication and a lot of work that's just come onto the shoulders of just a couple people. There's not too many people doing this. But when you start putting the facts and the figures together, that's when it becomes scary. When you start combining all this stuff and doing your timelines.
Do you think that they could still be doing this today?
Yes. We wouldn't hear about it as much.
We actually have a caller that's calling in to ask you another question. It says they're having phone problems. Oh, there it is. And you're on the air.
Oh, yeah. I have a question. How many airplanes generally go after, like, UFOs in a chase?
In a case?
In a chase, like, have you ever heard of any reports of airplanes just, like, chasing after a UFO?
Yeah, there's tons of them.
I think she's saying, like, how many airplanes would, like, in an average case would chase after a UFO is what I think she's saying. 2.
Yeah.
2, sometimes 4. Usually they
wow.
A wingmate or a wingman. It
wow.
was rare where one would go off by itself. Usually they were one up in 2s, or they were scrambled in 2s, or if there was 2 of them in a particular area, basically 2 or 4.
Yeah, so do they not want to go by themselves because they're not allowed, or for fear of just getting lost, or is there any reason why they go usually in 2s or 4s?
Just military procedure.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Fly with a wingman going into battle or on a scramble. There are some cases where there's been one aircraft, but generally 2.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you.
And then we have, like some of the cases that I was talking about earlier where there was multiple jet crashes. I found 13 cases where between 2 and 4 jets went down. There was 7 cases that involved a pair of jets, 2 cases involved 3 jets, and I have 4 cases that involved 4 jets. No mid-air collisions. These planes were just dropping out of the air for no known reasons. So in these instances, you have between 2 and 4. And out of those 13 jet crashes, which are multiple jet crashes, we're talking 13 cases, there was 36 jets in 13 episodes. 2 of them were Navy and 11 were Air Force. 6 of them occurred over America. 7 of them occurred over foreign countries. So this was going on all over the world.
Oh, wow.
On my website, there's a few different cases that I list up there and give a brief synopsis of what was going down there.
All right. Well, I'll check that out then.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks for calling in.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Hey, Frank, and I got another question for you as well. Okay, you know how you said some of these aircraft may just simply vanish out of nowhere? Do you think it may be possible that the extraterrestrials may be taking our aircraft to find out how we tick also, maybe?
Yeah, they could just be like there was a fellow called Tom Camella who wrote a famous article years ago, our UFO swallowing our aircraft, and he was investigating this stuff years ago. And I report on this in my book. Stanton Friedman talks about it in my book as well, and forward. How UFOs have just been coming out of the sky and just grabbing our jets and taking off with them. Who knows? Maybe they're being disintegrated. I don't know. But they're in all of these cases that I report on in the New York Times where all these jets vanished, there was never any follow-up article that they were ever found. And I looked pretty intently throughout the years. There was never. A lot of them, you would read an article like on a Monday, and it should have happened on a Saturday, and it's reported on Monday how a jet vanished. But then when I would read forward in the few following weeks, sometimes they found them and they were crashed, and they found them in the woods someplace. These cases I'm reporting on, they vanished, and there was never any follow-up, and they were officially gone. Period. And to this day, they've never been found. And what's scary is a lot of this has taken place over major cities. And there have been instances when you look on the other side of the coin that I found where jets, and this is in the 6 Deadly Years chapter of the book, were just dropping out of the sky and landing in neighborhoods and killing people, multiple people. And, you know, it was pretty crazy stuff that was going on. They were hitting and blowing houses up. Little kids are playing in the yard, getting sprayed by gas and incinerated, you know, burned alive. These just crazy, crazy things were going on. Now, my point here is where I'm going with this is when a jet would crash into a neighborhood, you would know it. Okay? It's going to leave a big hole in the ground. For one instance, a jet hit and impacted, collided with a parked car and launched the car for 3 blocks. So you know when a jet goes down. They were even screwy circumstances why these jets were crashing. But my point here is, what about the jets that were flying over towns and cities and just vanished? They never came down. You would notice it. Just gone, period. Some of them, there were a couple different points that would disappear, or there would be search and rescue and reconnaissance missions looking for lost jets and planes, and they would disappear too. You know, the follow-ups and rescue aircraft, you know, so a lot of crazy things that went on. And as I've said before, with a lot of these jet cases that were reported in the New York Times, what I found out is in the early 50s, you would have front-page articles that were big, giant shots of the crashes in the jets that had hit into a city and destroyed a neighborhood. Right on the front page, above the fold, top center. As I went on through the years, 51, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, by the time you got into 56, these full-blown articles with pictures weren't there anymore. There would be like a 1, 2, or 3 liner stuck in the back of the paper in like Macy's or Gimbel's underwear ads, you know, and like really tucked away where you really wouldn't see them. And that I saw over the years too. They weren't up front and center. When Stanton Friedman a few years ago was at National Archives, he did a little research and he was trying to look for some of the September Air Force accident report statistics, and he was unable to find them. What he did find for me was the June and July 1952 fighter accidents as reported by the Air Force. And let me throw these numbers by you because these are even more hair-raising than what I found out through the 6 Deadly Years. What the New York Times reported was only a fraction of what was actually going on. What Friedman found me was a memorandum that was dated September 10th, 1952, and it was a tabulation of major accidents as reported by the Air Force, and Lieutenant Colonel Myers was the officer. And here's the statistics. What I'm going to give you is the highlight of the UFO flap in June and July of 1952, the Washington sightings, okay? I'm going to give you the June 52 fighter major accidents, okay? Just in June, there was 100, and there was 36 aircraft destroyed and 21 fighter pilots killed in June alone. In July, there were preliminary reports, and they escalated. July 52 fighter major accidents reported by the Air Force was 135, 58 aircraft destroyed, and 30 fatalities. You're talking just 2 months of fatalities and crashes. Fighter planes, aircraft alone. This is not cargo, they're not bombers. What you have when you combine these stats, guys, June and July, 2 months, fighter major accidents, 235 in 2 months. 94 aircraft destroyed and 51 fighter pilots killed between June and July 1952.
It's a lot of random mistakes.
That was during the summer of the saucers.
Well, I had a quick question. Overall, would you say that UFOs are peaceful?
Yes, and less provoked.
Well, we have about 4 minutes left in the show, and I was going to use the last 4 minutes for you to talk about whatever you wanted about your new book, your websites, any sort of links or anything like that.
Well, we got www.flatwoodsmonster.com. That's my website, and there a lot of stuff I talked about tonight is on my website. We have the current information section there where you can see my master map, some of the UFO pictures, and some of the crop circle pictures I took in Fraintown. And I have constantly updating what's going on. I have a revised edition of my Braxton County Monster book, my original book. Right now I have my Shoot Them Down book. I have another book, should be coming out soon, called Duels of Death. And then, as you'll see on my website, it's the definitive Flatwoods Monster story. It's from myth to reality, the Flatwoods Monster. So if you keep updated and keep looking back at the website, you're going to hear and see a lot of new different things coming up.
Well, another thing was, if people wanted to purchase your books, where would they go to do that?
You can go right to flatwoodsmonster.com.
Alrighty.
The easiest place to get it, you can just click right onto my website, and you scroll down. There's a couple different places where you can get it directly from the publisher. Or when I'm out on the road, I'm going to be hitting the road again this year soon. If you want to see me or meet me at one of the lectures or book signings later on, get the book from me directly.
Oh, all right. Well, we have about 2 minutes left in the show. I wanted to thank you for going on our show. We had a really good show with you tonight. We still have a whole bunch of questions coming in and a whole bunch of our own questions. We'll have to do a follow-up sometime soon.
Yeah, sure. We'll come back on and do another show.
When's your new book supposed to come out?
We're working on that right now. I really don't know, but I'll keep everybody posted.
Okay.
My book my favorite one right now is the one that I've spent years on. It's Duels of Death, Flying Saucers in the United States Air Force. That is the book that picked up and took off where I left. The Shoot 'em Down book that's out now is basically 1952. This new book that I have encompasses about a 10-year cover.
Well, we have 90 seconds left in our show, it's telling us. But, yeah, again, Frank, thanks for coming on the show. We'll have to do a follow-up sometime and pretty soon. I'll let my co-host say their goodbyes.
All right, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Got any other questions? Just go to the website, flatwoodsmonster.com. There's a lot of stuff on there. It takes you hours to go through, and it's a lot of fun. If you have any questions, I can be reached through my website as well.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you so much.
Okay, guys. You have a
You
good night.
Good night.
too.
Yeah, you too.
Between what we see and what we think we know and believe, there are worlds. There are things that we cannot understand. Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Investigations team is in charge of